It's very strange. I think I should be sitting there with you because I'm supposed to contribute at the same time that I'm moderating.
It's a bit nerve-wracking to have you at my back, actually. But
oh, please. Actually, it's very, I have not met Tania before. I've been a great admirer of what she's done. I have met Jock before. Jock probably doesn't remember that. Well, we've had many connections over the ensuing years that I've been at the foundation, but I had just left Mountain Equipment Co-op as the CEO, and sort of the next day I started as the head of the David Suzuki Foundation. It was weird because I had gone from being a heroic business leader to this nefarious foreign-funded radical in 24 hours. And in that process, I got asked to go on a radio talk show with Jock. It was my first week on the job. I think it was Christie's show to talk about climate change and carbon. And I actually knew nothing about it at that time. I was a complete neophyte. And this mellifluous, is that the right word? He was so articulate, I thought I'm never going to be like Jock. So we have about 30 minutes of a conversation right now, and in the spirit of what this is all about, this particular gathering, we're talking about leadership and connecting, and the reflections that we're going to do are about essentially our sectors and our organizations, the trends we're seeing in our various different organizations and sectors, and then a little bit about how we apply ourselves as well. And I'm going to sort of seed this with a couple of questions, and I'm going to interject with my own viewpoints, and I'm hoping that we will end up as a bit of a conversation. That sounds all right, I hope.
Sounds good.
And the first one is going to be around our sectors, like what's happening, what are we seeing in our sectors? And I know there's different ways to approach this, Tania, Jock, but I think that, we could be the global or it could be, downtown Victoria. I think we're probably going to want to sort of keep it within the bounds of the country a little bit, although I'm sure Jock is going to want to talk about some of the trends that influence us from outside, and then we're going to go down into our organizations. So I'm going to start then by asking Tania. Oh, actually, just before we get going, it's very odd. This panel here, we've got a person representing business and a person representing arts and culture. I'm not quite sure what I represent at this particular moment in time. But what do we all have in common, which is, actually, I didn't notice until I started driving over from Vancouver. I thought, wait a minute here. What's very peculiar about this panel? We all represent nonprofit organizations. It's very odd that we have two charities and a nonprofit here, which is a little bit about, I think, where some of the leadership is showing up in our society these days. So Tania, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the arts and culture sector?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that it is thrilling to be here with all of you and to share in your excitement. It's really inspiring to be on this campus, to feel the energy here of so many people that are excited to be convocating and looking forward to a new life, a life that I think is very complex right now. There's so many challenges in our world, and yet there are so many possibilities, so many opportunities. So it's an exciting time. I would say that for my industry, distraction, the complexity of life and the distraction that brings would perhaps be one of the challenges that I want to focus on today. The sense that the world is moving at such a fast pace, that there are so many options for people to be a part of, so many different directions that we are pulled, and that the challenge is to be still and to value things that are deeper, to value things that are higher ideals. And in the case of culture, to get close to our roots as human beings, to get close to the history that is a part of who we are and that can find its way through the arts and be presented to us in that way, and to reach and connect to our own inner beings. Those are all of the things that are so incredibly important with the arts, and which I think the arts at this point really struggle and are striving to meet the challenges of connecting to audiences, connecting to this crazed society that we now have. So I would say that in my sector, we are seeing that people are less and less listening to classical music. In fact, less and less listening. There is a sense that you need a lot of things to do and lots of things to see and lots of happening and lots of action and things often are difficult to schedule in. People want to have something that they can do from their own home. I mean, isn't it really a tragedy in a way that we no longer go to the movie theater, we no longer can even bring ourselves to go to a store to get a movie or rent a movie. It has to be on a button right in our own living rooms. And that's where our society has gone. So I'd say all across North America in general, arts organizations are challenged to continue to reach their audiences and to continue to thrive. And they're working very, very hard to meet what I think are the necessary needs for all of us as humans, which is to still have those opportunities to deeply connect to something such as music that can express us where words simply can't, something that changes our lives, something that truly impacts and makes our lives more beautiful. Sometimes our own audiences, our own communities have lost sight of those important things, and it's our job to reconnect them. So I think one of the things that's really important from my viewpoint as a leader of our organization is to find ways to deepen relationships and to communicate to people. I am understanding and aware that people might have less and less upbringing, connection, whatever it is, to the composers or to the music. And so I want to bring them in. I want to draw them closer. I want to share more. I want to communicate as much as I can so people feel close. That's one of the goals that I have. Another goal that's very, very important is to be very spontaneous, very aware of how things are changing, how things need to always be connecting to us personally. There can be a sense that we're cut off with past tradition, and that, for instance, in the case of classical music, what does Beethoven have to do with my life here today in Victoria? And that's why I'm passionate about diversity and about finding meaningful ways for the arts to connect to who we are right now in our community, in our historical world, and to us as people. And that's why, for instance, the commemoration of World War I is very close to my heart. It's an opportunity to draw us into something that is very meaningful, very impactful on people in our community. And I think no matter who you are and what direction you're going in, you need to be very connected to not what was of the past, not what you think were the old traditions or the right ways, but to really clear it and to look closely at what is really happening today, what are the trends of today, and to keep moving with those times. Certainly with the Symphony, we are trying to do things with all sorts of media, and bringing in more experiences and a diversity of experiences that enable us to reach as many people and to connect them to this deep-seated belief that music is important to our life. And I think that one of the things that is also a very big core goal for me is to understand that our schools are also challenged. They have so many core aspects of the education that they want to impart upon students, and unfortunately the arts is diminishing more and more. Our general upbringing as young people is less and less connected to music, and so as an organization, it's a goal to always be reaching out to those youth and to be making a difference and connecting to them as much as possible. So that's a good starting point.
That is a great starting point. I'm going to have a follow-up question after we hear from Jock. But Jock, same question to you. What trends are you seeing? And I'm probably thinking that you've got quite a few on your
Lots of trends. I'll speak, I guess, Peter, on behalf of sort of corporate British Columbia, the larger companies that are doing business here, because those are the companies we work with. I would just mention, even the largest companies in BC are not very large on a global scale. They're, in fact, some of our biggest companies, if you put them up against US, Europe, China, are actually very, very small, but they're big in this marketplace. So I guess there's a couple of things I see. One is, even though it's 6 years since the global financial crisis and recession of 2008-9, we still have a very peculiar kind of economic environment that we're operating within. Interest rates are close to zero. Corporations are sitting, many of them are sitting on massive amounts of cash that they are reluctant to deploy in a productive fashion to invest in new assets and new businesses. Last year, IBM, which would rank as one of the biggest technology companies in the world, spent more money buying back its shares than it did investing in R&D, which is quite stunning for a company that's in an R&D intensive industry, because they, for various reasons, they couldn't see good opportunities or they were under shareholder pressure. So there's a lot of peculiar things going on, I would say, in the corporate world in the wake of the 2008-9 recession. There's a hesitancy, a tentativeness, a lack of confidence in where the world's going, a lack of confidence perhaps in where public policy is going. So that really is very widespread, and as somebody who's interested in seeing British Columbia prosper, I'm concerned about that hesitancy to invest and make decisions, because it means a lot of opportunities that we might have in BC and in Canada are perhaps not going to materialize. And maybe that'll sort itself out over time, or maybe we're in a new normal kind of economy where the world that we knew before 2008 ain't coming back. And that's actually my own bias, is kind of leaning in that direction. Second thing I see, even though there's still a fairly high level of unemployment, there's a lot of underemployment actually among young adults in Canada. In spite of that, a lot of corporate leaders are very focused on talent issues. There's a real preoccupation with talent retention, talent acquisition, talent development. A lot of concern about how the demographic change that we're going to be experiencing is going to impinge on their industries and their companies. The oldest baby boomers, or the first front wave of the baby boomers, I guess, hit 65 2 years ago, 2011, 3 years ago. And despite what you may hear or fear, most of them will leave the workforce when they get to be at 65 or before. Maybe not people in the academic world, but people in the rest of the world. Average retirement age is about 63 in Canada. In the public sector, it's actually 59. So people do actually move on from full-time employment, and we're about to see a monstrous wave of people leaving the workforce, at least full-time work, over the next number of years. And a lot of organizations are really seized with that, because it means that people in key leadership positions, people who've got organizational knowledge, tacit knowledge, customer knowledge, are going to be walking out the door. And how do you replace those people? How do you develop your talent base inside your own organization to replace them? So big preoccupation with that. And it's compounded in the Canadian context by the important role that immigrants are playing in the growth of the workforce. Here in BC, people born outside of Canada are 1/4 of the working age population. Metro Vancouver, they're actually 40%. By the end of the decade, they're going to be 30% across the province, probably closer to 40% in Metro Vancouver. So the pool of workers, potential workers you have as an organizational leader, increasingly is going to include a lot of folks who actually were born somewhere else, who've come to Canada. That raises issues around credential recognition, around providing workplaces that are supportive of an increasingly multicultural and heterogeneous workforce. A lot of companies are doing that, but I think there's more challenges that lie ahead. And the third point I would make, I guess, and Peter will be pleased to hear this, in the BC context, environmental issues, public concerns about environmental performance, fears about what's happening to the natural environment really loom very large here in BC for a lot of the industries I work for. A lot of it comes under this rubric of social license to operate, but much more of it has to do with just companies feeling the pressure to demonstrate that they are minimizing their environmental impact, taking into account environmental considerations in their operational decisions, in their strategic decisions, that they're good stewards of the environment to the extent they're able to demonstrate that, that they're meeting public expectations. And I can tell you that is a huge challenge for a lot of the industries we have in BC. Even though they're throwing unprecedented resources at it, in many ways I think they are falling behind public expectations, and that is a top of mind concern for a lot of the senior executives, and mainly in natural resource industries, but it even goes beyond that into manufacturing and some of the suppliers of infrastructure. So lots of issues on the agenda for corporate BC as we move to the end of 2014.
Thanks, Jock. And I'll follow up a little bit about what you said, and then I've got a couple of follow-up questions for both of you. But it's interesting that you would say what is the kind of the feeling, the mood in British Columbia on environmental issues, and this notion of social license, by the way, the term was coined out of the business sector in the first place, as I think it was a mining executive who coined it on the basis that if you don't find a way to connect with the communities that you're going to be doing your resource work in, then the community may not welcome you with open arms. And it's certainly then has gone on from there. But from my perspective, the trend that goes with that is an increased polarization. And the polarization is compounded by the fact that it's often then vocalized as, from all different parties, as more or less an anger or as a conflict. And in that increased polarization, do we actually end up with an inability sometimes to reach agreements? So maybe, Jock, you can just tell us a little bit more about how you see some of those issues in British Columbia coming to some favorable outcome for all parties.
I'll have to think about that one for a few moments. But, you know, I think it goes back to trust, Peter. I think if you look at public opinion surveys, whether this is a positive trend or a negative trend, I guess people can debate. But public trust in a lot of institutions has eroded over time. It's true of business. It's absolutely true of governments and political leaders who are actually at the bottom. It's true of journalists, the media. And it's certainly true of large enterprises that are operating in the provincial economy and in the Canadian economy. So that erosion of public trust and confidence, that really goes to the heart of this social license issue, because traditionally companies said, if I'm complying with the law, the standards, the regulations, the rules that are laid out by duly elected accountable governments, then I can get my business done. I can do what it is I need to do to build my mine or to run my train. Today, that really is no longer the model that's working. You can get all the rules covered off, check all the boxes, and you can still face formidable public opposition and concern for a whole variety of different reasons. And I think the corporate sector is really struggling to get its head wrapped around that reality and figure out what it means. The solution to it is not throwing millions of dollars at TV advertising, although some industries are doing it. I think the solution is going to come through if there is one, is going to come much more through a kind of a ground level engagement, frankly, with people, with citizen groups, with communities, where you can kind of rebuild some of that trust from the ground up. Where are we at in that process in BC? We're not very far along, I would say, in that. And in my world, my organization, we're spending a lot of time scratching our heads, trying to figure out how we can be a constructive voice in that necessary work.
Yeah, it does mean that some of those decisions then may take a little bit longer if we're going to do that. Tania, you and I both represent charitable organizations. It's an interesting fact that there are 85,000 registered charities in this country, and they collectively employ 10% of the workforce. They're not a small group. And in fact, and Jock would know this, they actually employ more people than do the resource extraction industries. That's a lot of folks working in those sectors. Now, they represent everything from big universities and hospitals down to small groups that are working in communities on stream restoration or a kindergarten that's doing something in their local group. What's not known very well, though, is that 52% of the funding for the charitable sector comes from government. And that number is decreasing rapidly over time as government either cuts back on their own spending or starts to offload, in some cases, some of the services. So for a charity, we are then faced constantly with this notion of how do we raise resources for what we try to do in this increasingly competitive environment for trying to get money when in fact governments are not supporting us as much. When in your field, in your area, how does that translate in kind of the survival of you've talked about the artistic element of it and the technological, but how does it just work for you on the day-to-day survival in this increasingly challenged financial world?
Well, it's very interesting because, as I alluded to before, the financial ramifications of supporting not-for-profit arts organizations is becoming more and more stressed. There are organizations, orchestras, and other organizations across North America that are folding or having to cut back. And those are deeply stressful issues. that we all have to deal with. In Canada, we kind of look at our orchestras in three parts. There's a third of our budget that comes from government, and there's a third of our budget that comes from ticket sales, and a third of our budget that comes from sponsorship and support. And what's very interesting about that model for us is that they are all so deeply connected. First of all, we have been feeling in the last few years the the worry and the lack of something that we can count on when it comes to the government funding, because sometimes we will have a regular amount that we have been counting on for years and that we plan on, and suddenly that can be cut in half, as happened to us a few years back with the BC Arts Council in that particular case. So there's moments where an organization that each year struggles very hard to make all of the parts come together so that you have a balanced and healthy budget. We have to start thinking outside of where the government is supporting us and be stronger ourselves. And what that means for us is, first of all, investing very deeply in who we are, the quality of what we are, and being, absolutely the best that we can be, as I was saying before, to connect to people, to develop a very close family of people who care about your organization, who care about the arts in general. And there's a huge reliance upon those people to support the orchestra and to be there for the orchestra as all of the other aspects start to falter in the wake of perhaps ticket sales as they change, or government support. And so I think orchestras and any arts organization and any not-for-profit organization needs to be with great integrity, with great spirit in building the relationships that are so important to keep them going and to support them.
Thank you. Now we're going to have time for a couple of questions, so if you have one, there's a couple of mics on either side. You can start making your way up there soon, and while you're thinking about what a question might be and who you're going to direct it to, I have one more question for the panel here. Tania mentioned earlier the issue of sort of reconnecting with, since connecting is the theme of this event, with connecting with youth who might not have been exposed to classical music. And Jock talked about the challenge that exists in underemployment amongst youth. At the David Suzuki Foundation, it's quite intriguing. The average age of an employee there, I think, is 29. So it's a very young organization. Boy, do they keep me on my toes. There is something about having kind of a workforce that's largely filled with millennials that has its own unique challenges. I love it. I will say that. But Tania, just to go back to a generational connection, a generational shift, and then I'll ask kind of the same thing of Jock. But you're having the double challenge, I think, of not just your product connecting with younger generation, but attracting people to be in those schools for classical music. How do you think this is how are you gonna realistically address it over time? This
is one of the great challenges, because I think if you talk to anybody from within our organization, we would all say that connecting to the youth and bringing them close to music is one of our greatest priorities. But we are in this sort of catch-22 of also needing to sustain ourselves and to make connections to people that are actually buying tickets, people who are actually supporting us financially. And often that doesn't relate to those educational programs where, for instance, a sponsor might not achieve a lot of bang for his buck for a group of grade 4 students. So I think that this is one of the challenges that we're still struggling very much with. First of all, inspiring people who do support classical music and who love it to work with us, to be a team with us for the various programs that we do as we try to expand our abilities to kind of integrate and relate to the young people, and just to provide, again, getting back to diversity, making sure that we are providing so many different opportunities and things that are, unexpected and unusual. I mean, this year we're going to have an open rehearsal where people can bring their instruments, and we're hoping to have youth and adults alike coming to do that. But these sorts of ideas of trying to find a variety of ways to connect, I think, is where we're at.
Now, just before I ask Jock a similar one, I'm not seeing anyone coming up to the mic. One of the prerogatives of being the moderator is that if no one comes up, I'm going to select people. And they will be my tormentors in my doctoral program, Bernard. So you better wish somebody comes up here and asks a question, or you're going to have to ask one. Now, Jock, you mentioned underemployment. And you also talked about retirement. So we are facing kind of a double whammy here, in that the expectation of when you can retire, notwithstanding the numbers that you've quoted, seems to be that within each succeeding year that gets to be a little further down the pathway for a lot of folks who are planning retirement. And what that does, of course, is it means that we almost have, if I can use the word, a bottleneck in organizations for movement up inside them. And if they're not growing, then it creates obviously challenges for those organizations. Can you spend a bit more time talking about how the business sector deals with the reality of wanting to bring keen young talent into an organization, but also support the fact that people have expectations and lives and careers, and they're fulfilling them themselves? How does that tension unfold?
Well, from what I've seen, most big companies are actually wanting to bring in new blood on a regular basis. It's not particularly healthy for a large organization to stop hiring. In fact, the government of Canada, when I was working in Ottawa in the early 90s during the deficit crisis, essentially had a hiring freeze that they brought in for several years. And it's hurting them now downstream 10, 15, 20 years later, because they don't have the right pools of talent having been developed along the different stages of professional kind of career evolution. So I think large companies, frankly, are quite keen to see new blood come in. They recognize that a lot of their long-serving employees are going to retire. Contrary to some of the media speculation, most of them do retire, as I mentioned before. So yes, there's anecdotes of people saying, I lost, half my RRSP and in a bad stock investment, I have to keep working, and those are out there. But if you look at the broad data, people are still retiring more or less a little bit later. I mean, it has pushed out a little bit, but it's not dramatic. And of course, a lot of people work in organizations that actually have either required retirement ages or pension plans that encourage people to retire at a certain age. So there's quite a bit of turnover, and although I have a lot of sympathy with the challenges that I think a lot of young adults are facing in the workforce context, not just here, it's all across the OECD economies these days. I actually think it's going to get quite a bit better over the next 5 to 10 years as these initial waves of baby boomers exit the workforce and a lot of companies start to step up their hiring activity, which has been pretty slow, to be candid, for a few years. So I think, anyone who's running an organization and is looking to the long term, having the right talent in place is going to want to bring in some new blood on an ongoing basis. But I'll just end with a comment about this current kind of economic environment we're in, where there's a lot of reticence to pull the trigger to make decisions in a lot of companies, and that has got downstream implications in slowing kind of the human resource turnover that I think you need to have a healthy market economy and healthy enterprises.
By the way, what are you hearing about debt amongst households at different age demographics? What's your sense of what that looks like?
Well, household debt in household debt in Canada has risen very significantly over the past 15 years. Of course, when interest rates are zero, it's an attractive time to take on debt in some respects. So when our policymakers express surprise that debt's gone up, it's a bit of sucking and blowing at the same time, because they've created an environment with record low interest rates. But yeah, we have surpassed the United States for the first time in my career. I never would have thought this was even conceivable 10 or 20 years ago. But the level of household debt in Canada relative to income is now 20 percentage points higher, roughly, than it is in the United States. Now, there's some artificial things in there, including all the people who've gone bankrupt in the United States, which have wiped out their debts. So their debt burden has gone down a bit because of that. But it's also true, Peter, that household net worth is at an all-time high in Canada. So, the debt's been acquired to take on assets in many cases, primarily real estate assets, and those have gone up in value. So the current situation doesn't necessarily look dire unless one thinks that we're going to have a housing market correction that's serious, and that's the biggest vulnerability to the Canadian economy, I think, today, but I'm not predicting it. Or if you believe that interest rates are going to suddenly shoot up in a very significant way, which would really squeeze the households that have taken on a lot of debt. Young adults, though, back to your question, are more indebted today. Sort of adults, young sort of people 20 to 30, are more indebted today, both absolutely and relative to the rest of the population, than was true 20 or 30 years ago. So we have seen a faster erosion, if you will, in the financial sort of balance sheets of younger adults, and that's because of student debt, struggles in the job market, and low interest rates on savings for those who do have savings.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to some questions here, and as you can tell, the themes that are coming out of this are really kind of the pace of change and adapting to that change as we go forward. I'll start with Doug, and then we'll go there, and then we'll go there, and if we have time, then we'll go there. And I'm supposed to get you out of here just around 2, maybe a little bit after. So do you have a question? And brief question,
Yes.
who are you directing it to? And
It's actually probably to Jock mostly because he talked about organizations not necessarily pulling the trigger on decisions. I'm seeing that a lot more, and it seems to be around the speed of change and people not wanting to make a mistake. Is it about that, or is it about people not embracing the fact that there is always going to be change and looking at, instead of the fear part of it, the opportunity part of it?
I think it varies a lot, Doug, across companies and industries. Some sectors, there is a real uncertainty about what the economic future looks like in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So that partly explains, I think, the reluctance to make decisions. Other industries are being roiled by disruptive technological change. You see this in the retail sector in particular with, the move to online purchases, Amazon, a giant, sort of Goliath coming through the door into the retail space. The whole move to a digital economy, how does that play out in different industry sectors? It's a very kind of exciting time for a lot of people because of that, but for a lot of large organizations, it's I wouldn't say leading to paralysis, but it's leading to some confusion about what the future business models look like. And that then has ramifications for hiring decisions and decisions to invest in growth. So it's quite troubling because in a world of record low interest rates, you think people will be looking at longer term kind of decision calculus. But in fact, what we're seeing is the exact opposite in a lot of market economies. The pressure on companies to produce short-term financial returns has intensified at a time when, in a macroeconomic sense, you might have expected the opposite. So I see that playing out in a lot of the companies that I'm dealing with, and it's, maybe it'll sort itself out over the next year or two, or maybe we're in some kind of new equilibrium for market economies that will look quite different than the past. I'm not sure on that, but it's a big question.
I would add to that too, that for the Symphony, we are very much feeling the pressure to do exactly that. The sense that if you take a risk and you try to program new things, go in new directions, that the risk can, again, with a not-for-profit organization that doesn't have a lot of room for mistakes, there's this paralysis that wants to come over us and wants us to just stay with the model, the traditional model. But I'd say that in our industry, everyone understands and is searching for what are the new answers, what are the new ways to make change in the arts, and that there is no possibility for us to remain conservative. We have to move forward.
Over to this mic here. And if people are having to make 2 o'clock appointments, I see some folks leaving, you'll just have to tiptoe out of the room.
I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
So I'm one of those baby boomers who is not going anywhere.
Okay.
All right? So just to set up the context. So I had a comment and for you, John, and a question. Jock, sorry. Yeah, and a question for Tania. the comment is that that we're seeing a little bit more in organizations where people like myself at sort of can see retirement at the other end versus, they can see the light that way versus the other way, that we tend to move into part-time mentorship roles or training, or we become, even in business, we become instructors that actually help to bring younger people along. And I guess my comment is that if we see more and more of that happening, then I think we're in for a better future than the way it's sitting right now. My question for you, though, Tania, is the concept of the mind and the spirit being a lot greater than what you can measure. And when we talk about in the business faculty about that which gets measured gets done. So are there ways in which we can have concrete strategies that can solve some of the situations that you have raised in terms of bringing people to become, or mainly we'll talk about millennials, or even some of the people, some of even my students are in their 30s, to focus more and be able to focus on different things and have a little bit more of an attention span so that their minds can expand a little more. And I think we're lacking that in our education system. So the question is, what would you do?
Well, I think one thing that's so important is to be thoughtful about what our goals are for society, to really think about those ahead. I think in society, if we just carry on going from one thing to the next, we're doing our very best in each day to try to do meaningful things. But we all need to stand back, and as a society, as organizations, we need to stand back and say what builds a happy, a meaningful life with integrity, one that's deeply committed to community, one that's deeply invested in community and the greater good of the world, right? And I think that this is the challenge for an organization, for any organization that has the ability to do so. The challenge for us is to help people find and experience how important those moments are, those moments where something has slowed down perhaps, where they've experienced something that, in the normal daily life they aren't getting. How do we do that? As I said, first of all, I think communication is so important so that people understand why it's important. Talking about music, as you're talking about something that's tangible versus that's not. How do you measure things? In the symphonic world, we can measure whether things are working in certain ways, like ticket sales. They're either coming or they're not. Or how many young people, how many older people, what age, all of those things. But there's part of that is also the feel of what kind of inspiration was felt in that moment, in that room, on that day, and what kind of feeling are you inspiring in the community through the communication that you have with that community, through the people in it. You will be able to find out how deeply you are connecting to them. With young people, most of the musicians, for instance, in the Symphony, they're teaching people that are at the University of Victoria or at the Conservatory. They're investing in the community themselves. And I think that the more that we can, again, on a bigger perspective, define for our communities what we think is important, or help the community as a whole come to terms with what is important in a balanced, healthy life. That's how we can help as an organization.
I'm going to squeeze one more in, mainly because Alan took too long when he was doing his introduction. So, last question to you.
And this might be quite a follow-up on what you were speaking about earlier, Tania. I want to come back to, you spoke about how it's more and more difficult to listen today, and I teach conflict management here, so obviously listening and learning how to listen is an important part of that. So maybe you have some specific recommendations for us as individuals, but also as a community, and what is it that we can do to make more space to listen in our lives, not just to music, not just to environmental issues, but to each other as well, and in general to support community in that way?
I guess what I would say is that when we have these experiences, even being here today and to hear the history of the First Nations people on this land, or to experience, I mean, the amazing intelligence of Jock beside me and his experiences, to realize that sometimes in our world we are so focused on our goals. I'm a hugely goal-oriented person. I think you probably all are too, and you've achieved a great goal today or tomorrow. But we have lost perspective, I think, in this new era of ours. We've lost the grip on what it is to be human first. And perhaps the first place to gain that is to go back to why your own family is so important to you. What are the aspects of your roots, of your upbringing, of your foundation that are the most meaningful to you? And then how do you see that relating to society in general? Conflict management is probably a greater and greater issue because people communicate less and less. Nobody talks to people anymore, they text. And I've even seen great marital issues being discussed by text. It's awful when you think about it. Sometimes with music, or sometimes just with communication in general, we are placed in a very vulnerable a place that we don't often allow ourselves to reach, which is to be open and to take a moment to listen. And the listening is about feeling other people around you, hearing what they are, who they are, where they've come from, what is important to them. And I think music, for instance, is one way out of many. So is beautiful nature. So is so many opportunities that we have to just have friendship and connection to people. So is travel. There's so many meaningful things in our world that sometimes we put into a secondary category as we propel ourselves to our goals. And so today you have a goal that you've achieved. You've got goals for the future for yourselves. I'm a mother of 2 young boys, and I have found the challenge, the ultimate challenge of retaining what is deep, what is meaningful, and what is ultimately human as the most necessary foundation for happiness as you go forward and for success. And I find that those things, I'm lucky because somehow I'm pumped up by the message of the music, which comes from people, which comes from history, which comes from culture. So somehow I am consistently in my work inspired and changed. And I guess that's all I want for the rest of the world, is that opportunity to find that thing for them that keeps you on the right path of being true to yourself and avoiding conflict.
That's a beautiful answer. And I'm going to ask, believe it or not, Jock, the same question of you, which is there's this myth somehow that businesses are monolithic, impersonal. They don't have those same issues that the rest of us have. But of course, that's a complete myth. When you look at the business sector, how do they cope with those very same issues that Tania and the question reflected? In other words, the showing of empathy within an organization.
Well, I think the well-managed ones find ways to create cultures and organizations that do that provide supports for employees, that appreciate that there's more to people than their work face, to go back to what Tania is saying. But of course, not every company is well managed, and a lot of them are, frankly, pursuing short-term financial goals, which sometimes can come at a price vis-a-vis some of the other things that are important in life. So it's tough to generalize about business. There's 380,000 businesses of one sort or another in the province of British Columbia, which is a lot of enterprises. Most of them, of course, are very small. They're entrepreneurial, and so they reflect the personalities, the foibles, the genius that individuals have, because most businesses are in fact single-person firms, 2 or 3-person firms. I think as you build larger organizations, though, you really do run the risk of losing some of that connectivity to things that are outside of the workplace, outside of the economic construct that a lot of us are are motivated by. And it's how do you run a 10,000 employee organization and create that kind of feeling with your employees, that management really cares about them, that you're all part of a sort of collective trying to achieve something. When you're dealing with a turbulent, challenging external environment, when you're dealing with shareholders who I would say have an increasingly short-run horizon, and there's lots of research that sort of bears that out. So it's, although I'm a kind of pro-free market economist guy, I'm not actually convinced that Western capitalism, as it's evolved during my lifetime, is going to survive in its current form and configuration than what we have today. I see a lot of sort of dialectic tensions playing out in the business world, and I'm wondering whether we might end up in 50 or 100 years, which I'm not going to see, but with a different kind of economic model. I didn't used to think that way, but I've actually kind of opened my mind to thinking a little differently about what our economic future might look like, partly because of what we've gone through over the past 5 or 6 years, which really has been very, very wrenching for those who believed in the equilibrating forces of markets and believed in that people running financial institutions actually knew what they were doing, and that there was a kind of stability, a macroeconomic stability that had developed in our economy. I think today we see that the faith we had in that a number of years ago was perhaps misplaced. So what lies ahead based on that, I think, is really an open question at this stage.
Agreed. And that's a good place to end our conversation. It was an interesting concept that the university had said that this would be an opportunity to have the folks who are getting honorary degrees, who are outstanding in their communities, connect with the audiences, the students, the friends and families in a way that is a little deeper than seeing them on the stage. So I'm really appreciative that so many folks came out. I'm absolutely blown away by the two of you. That was a very good series of responses in a short 30 to 40 minutes. And I think we are deeply gratified to see two leaders of your nature in British Columbia as we go forward. So let me ask you to join me in thanking them.